So with all the news and info dump that we got about Captain Marvel, one interesting piece that came out is why exactly the movie's set in the 90s as to not interfere with everything else they're doing. So let's talk about the little details and I think what it means for the future of the character by herself. So as most of you know, we've talked about this plenty of times, Captain Marvel is set in the 90s. It's going to have a very 90s vibe. They want to capture that nostalgia for a lot of current, I guess, millennials and stuff that remember that time, right? And this is kind of one of those interesting things where the 80s are slowly leaving us and we see that there's this transitional period and the 90s now are for like 30-year-olds to 40-year-olds, right? Because they grew up in them and you want to try to capture that. There's a lot of music that's seminal to that. There's a lot of TV shows, references, shows like Friends, which went on to redefine what it meant to be a, comedy on prime time, and the advent of the internet and how information came out there. And when you think about it, we haven't had a superhero movie set in that period that's been made today. And it's a period of time that's just kind of there for, I guess, gold mining, if you will, because of how much it gives you for pop culture reference, much like Stranger Things really made the 80s boom again. And they recently said that the reason Captain Marvel is set in the 90s as opposed to modern day was they felt it was disconnected enough from Captain America to Iron Man 1, where it's like that 20 years prior where they can really go in there and play around with some elements 15 to 20 years before, and it gives Carol her own section of the universe that hasn't been explored. Now obviously they're referencing the Skrull and Kree War, which will be to some degree playing a role in this movie. And we see, Korath is returning before he shows up in Guardians. We see Ronan. He seems to be very tight-knit with the guard, with the I guess the guard, or however they're going to be called, Captain Marvel, played by Jude Law. So it gives you this period of time where it doesn't seem like that there's that giant war happening that divides space out there, that divides the Novas and everything. And I think that's really what they want to push, because the sequel is going to have to jump to post-Avengers 4, which if you set the first movie at any point during any of the existence during the current MCU, it would propose a lot of problems, because then why didn't the character ever show up at any other time? And sure, that's a question we still have because of the pager at the end when he calls her, but we haven't seen the movie yet to understand where she goes and why exactly she waits for this one specific moment. And with the Skrulls having invaded, obviously, Earth and how that's going to play out, I think you start to formulate this idea of they're going to add a small retcon or changes to the MCU that we haven't necessarily expected or experienced before, because everybody's expecting someone is going to be revealed as a Skrull. Who it is, we don't know, but that gives it that little thing where we look at the MCU in a completely different light. And when you think about it that way, it makes Captain Marvel a big piece of the puzzle that we haven't had, that we can retroactively look at and go, that's why it's set in the 90s, because then it has a through line. So she's going to be like Star-Lord when she shows up in modern day. Everything's a little off, which gives us that same Captain America connection where she's more serious, but Star-Lord is more comedic. So it is a passing of the torch again, and much like Captain America, she's going to be our modern day kind of, let me explain the modern situation by bringing in the comic aspect, which is something hard to sell. But then again, Marvel hasn't failed to do that at any point so far, so I think it'll succeed. So I think ultimately they made the best decision, while at the same time making sure they can, carve out their own piece of the MCU and not interfere with anything else in there. So I think it'll work.